So what that means is that the apparatus we use for thinking about anything, system of reason, already has a notion of an afterlife imprinted like a shadow in it. And unless you take that into account, we'll never get further with rational inquiry into the afterlife.
Well, Raymond, thank you so much for giving us the chance to speak to you. No, you cannot believe how grateful I am to be able to sit down and have this conversation with you.
You better can recheck your perception, because I'm just kind of a normal, or not normal, but not exceptional.
Well, I think you have done some exceptional work, so I think you deserve some credits, to be fair.
I'm not sure. I don't think of it that way. I got this from Plato and George Ritchie and from my philosophy professors.
Everyone needs a mentor, right?
George was one of my, an incredible influence on me. And I found out about this in connection with Greek philosophy. And that is still where it belongs, as I will show in my forthcoming book, Swan Song, which is the first chapter of it talks about how the very philosophers who set up the system of reason and logic that we use, the when the main one of the main questions they were investigating was the life after death. So what that means is that the apparatus we use for thinking about anything, system of reason, already has a notion of an afterlife imprinted like a shadow in it. And unless you take that into account, we'll never get further with rational inquiry into the afterlife. But this book will bring it about. And I'm saying that not to start a new religion, but I'm going to put this out there and ask people to refute me, because that's the process. If somebody turns up some real objection, then I will be moved closer to understanding the truth. But if there aren't any real objections, then that gives me some degree of confidence that I'm on the right track, but not complete confidence. It's always got to be provisional. And but where I am on it, Dani, is that I know all of the classical objections. I was a professor of philosophy. I'd studied philosophy since I was 18 years old. And that is where the real issues lie. To call life after death a scientific question in 2025 sounds nice because people like that word science, but it has no cognitive content. There's no way of proving life after death scientifically, simply because there's no cognitively meaningful proposition there to confirm or disconfirm. But that's all right. It's the real problem with the question of life after death, as David Hume and A.J. Ayer and even Plato, in a way, pointed out, is that even though the notion brings nice feelings to our mind and maybe even warm and fuzzy images, that there's no cognitive content. But that is okay, and it's exactly what you would expect. Become in your mind somebody in the year 1915 who is highly educated and very well informed. And now listen to the following two sentences. First sentence: all four of Effort's grandparents perished and were lost in a shipwreck long before her mother and father were born. That's nonsense, right? In 1915. Go forward to 2025 with the knowledge of the role of DNA and heredity, the gene splicing, gene editing, and cloning. We have an intelligible scenario. Or go back to 1915 and listen to this sentence. I watched a movie on my phone this morning. Unintelligibility is a shifting phenomenon. And where we are now is that we are on the we're we're making sense of the notion of an afterlife in a whole new way because we have new logical techniques for us to analyze the concept more accurately.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. So this begs the question. What I found really interesting is that even after your Life After Life book, at the end of it, you weren't quite convinced that there was life after death. Most people don't know that. So what was that thing that made it for you?
Well, first of all, I don't want to say that I know that there's an afterlife. Okay. But what I could say is, and let me explain this because this will be of interest to the larger community of people who talk about this. In this subculture we're in, the the personnel are divided into the um, doctors who study it and take it seriously, and then on the other hand, the so-called skeptics, right? Well, the so-called skeptics I could prove very quickly are ignoramuses because, and I want to say this has nothing to do with my interest in near death experiences. This is to my interest in Greek philosophy. I love to teach Greek philosophy. And when I get to Pyrrho, Pyrrho, who was the founder of the skeptical movement, I have to undo the damage on my students' minds that those utter morons have done. They have no idea what being a skeptic is. It's just a word to them, which they have rallied around. Many of them are uneducated. They're entertainers like magicians and so on. They think they know everything. Um, but but Pyrrho's after Aristotle codified logic, Pyrrho 20 years later knew logic very well. That was the essence of it, right? And at that time, there was not a clear distinction between the intellectual and the spiritual quest. Right? It would have made no sense to Plato or Aristotle. And so Pyrrho Pyrrho's practice was as spiritual as it was intellectual. And this was his insight. We know logic very well and we know how to use it. And if you think about it, you can think of logic as an apparatus for generating conclusions from premises. Right? So if you think about it geometrically and everybody else is rushing in this direction to get to the conclusion, is how people usually use logic. Right? But Pyrrho said, what if we do it another way? What if we really bear down? We ask every question and we invoke rigorous logic. But then in the end, and this is what skepticism means, we refrain from drawing a conclusion because number one, if you practice assiduously not drawing conclusions, it creates a very interesting form of mind expansion, which Hume and many others have observed. But also, if you think of it geometrically, uh, because you're not looking this way, you're seeing side pathways of inquiry that nobody else missed because they're headed. Everybody else missed because they're headed to the conclusion. Okay, so now read that knowledge back across the words that you hear from these utter morons, which they really are. I'm a skeptic about these near death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. Read that back among your knowledge of skeptics. It means I am a person who does not draw conclusions, and my conclusion is that near death experiences are the chemistry of the brain. That is a self contradiction. And the main thing I want to say to these moron skeptics is read up a little bit. It is a very adolescent mindset. Many of them are very immature. It is actually a wing of a religion called humanism, which it consists of people who were were formerly religious but turned away from it and became atheists, but they still have some sort of longing for it. So humanism is a religion for people who want to, be against religion, right? And about peer, that none of them, I've asked a lot of them over the years, peer up here, they have no idea who I'm talking about. So what that means is they're ignoramuses. And I say this, as I said, it's nothing to do with near-death experiences. It's the fact that I love to teach about Piro. And when I get to Piro, all of these students, they have no idea what the word means because of these magicians, very often uneducated magicians are kind of like good old, there's a certain kind of obnoxious character that comes with that group. And they're very adolescent, and so, but I do want to say that that magazine, the Skeptical magazine, does some good in exposing fraud. So I don't want to be entirely negative. It's just that is to approach a problem like life after death with not even knowing the very what the word means that you're using is irresponsible and crazy. So what I'm getting at here is that, and may I say too that Pyrrho was one of the Greek philosophers that went to India with Alexander the Great, and when he got over there, he consorted with the Buddhists who were in India at the time, and when he came back to Greece, he perambulated, which is a Buddhist practice, and he meditated. And the earliest writings about Buddhism are not from India, but from Greece. And so my point here is that this is such a rich heritage, and that these goofballs and morons who are used often second level scientists or engineers or entertainers or just obnoxious people, but who and there is a certain service they do, which is that they do expose fraud, but at the same time change your name or something. I mean, just don't complicate things for people who love to read Greek philosophy. You're foolish if you do that, because these nice folks whose names you are taking in vain are a big part of uh, the Western philosophical heritage, and it's only nincompoops who use a word who don't when they don't know what it means.
No, I really love the fact that you're bringing back the original meaning of skepsis, which
Yeah,
is the observation.
meaning is always had. I've loved Pyrrho since I was 18 years old. And to hear all these morons use the word that I mean, it's crazy. Yeah, and it's a great disservice to people who are genuinely interested in the intellectual life, for those entertainers who are not educated and second level scientists, to form an organization around a word that they don't even know what it means. Having that said, then the founder of that movement, Paul Kurtz, was a dear man, and I loved him dearly. And Paul too had some of that were saying misgivings about the membership than I did, and so we talked about that also. Nice. Yeah, but Paul was a wonderful man.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing, Raymond. So I do have a question. I know we had this conversation already, but I think our audience would appreciate the answer, because I found it really fascinating. So when you coined the term near-death experience, or at least you presented it in your book, Life After Life, exactly half a century ago, could you have ever imagined what you would have started?
No, I was more thinking that this book would probably go to a small number of doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists who add it, and I just surmise, well, let's say 1,000 books sold to doctors, right?
Right.
That probably, a certain percentage of it, you couldn't expect that all of them would test it out, but in a group, you could say somebody will test this out. And I was absolutely, completely sure that anybody who really went at it and looked in it would find the same things. So I was not, I had no idea that it would multiply like it did. Yeah.
And are we allowed to know how many million copies have you sold by now?
Well, the last I heard from the publisher was 20 million copies. Yeah. Yeah.
That's great. Well, so I'm particularly fascinated about because you're not really an experiencer. I know you had a shared death experience, but a strict NDE. So I'm very interested in the after effects on those that may have not had the direct experience, but perhaps have studied these topics for decades, like yourself. So I'd love to start with the obvious question, I guess, for some: are you afraid of death these days?
Fear of death is not one thing. And I had a lot of patients come to me over the years because they were afraid of death. And so the first thing you got to do is you got to figure out what are they talking about, right? And so what people say, if you ask a lot of people, what do they fear in death? Some people say, I fear that it might be painful. Count me in. All right, I don't want any pain.
So fear of dying again.
Yeah, that's right. That some people feel, they fear that dying might be a painful process, right? And I've had gallstones, I've had kidneys. I'm finished with pain. And yeah, I sure hope fear is it? Yeah, maybe a little bit. Sure hope I don't, die in pain. Other people um, fear obliteration, right? Nah, I don't know what I think about obliteration. Um, in the sense that do I um, fear obliteration? No, absolutely not, because I've kind of figured out that it's far from obliteration. It's a kind of increase in your energy level, right? Other people fear hell because they were tormented by, know nothing fundamentalist preachers, and they often turn away from religion, but they're often afraid of hell. Um, and a lot of people fear the unknown. I'm not afraid of the unknown. It's the known that scares me. All right. And um, then the there is another kind of group um, that's just a kind of vague, like it's an anxiety that they can't put their fingers on. And I don't have that either, because and another thing is, I've never been in a situation where I would hope that there's life after death. I just don't know what they're talking about. How hoping that there's life after death doesn't make any sense to me, because to me, I want to know what is, you know. And then the other thing is, a lot of people fear, being separated from their loved ones. Count me on that too. And I still got two wonderful kids at home, and my wife, and I want to stay around for,
As long as possible.
until God calls me. Really, it's another thing is it's up to God. You know, I did not start life religious. I lived in the deep South, and my family didn't go to church because we were afraid of snakes. And my dad was a hardened, he saw horrific combat in World War II and the getting ready for the invasion of Japan as a medic. Imagine all the injuries and he saw, but so he was hostile to religion. Then when I was about 12 years old, which would have been his his midlife crisis, he had a brief flirtation with church, and I think it's probably just maybe there's something to this. And so he hauled me to this Presbyterian church for 3 times. And after the third time, he said, "All right, Raymond, you don't have to go anymore." So my church experience was 3 tormented hours among people who just were sure of themselves and felt they knew everything. And I don't think I know much of anything, right? And I've never been able to understand how people think it's like it, when the early philosophers formed the Western way of thinking, it was a process which took place over about 280 years, full of all kinds of amazing things. And I came into philosophy when I was 18 years old and fell in love with Greek philosophy. And in reality, Donnie, you can't understand the notion of an afterlife until you understand the role it played in Greek philosophy, because the system of reason and logic that you and I are using at this very moment was developed by Greek philosophers, and one of the main questions they were testing it on was the question of life after death. So if you think about it, that means that there is a negative image of, I mean, not in the sense of negative feelings or something, but like a photographic negative, right? That in the structure of reason itself, there's like a photographic negative that represents the afterlife. It's like a little tin of it in there. So whenever we start investigating the afterlife, we're reasoning in a circus. Right? So you've got to get out of that, right?
That's great, Raymond. So, wonder if there's any other changes that you encountered in the way that perhaps all your research has affected the way you look at life.
You know, Donnie, it's very difficult for me to say that because, see, I found out about this when I was 18 years old. I'm 81 here. So it's impossible for me to go back and say George Ritchie was, the great, one of the most influential figures of my life. I can't separate what I have no way of separating my life development from the near death experience. See? Because I encountered it at such an early age.
That's a very good point.
And also because the very tools that I used to investigate it were came from when I was 8 years old. Basically, what happened was that I was a big fan of Lewis Carroll and Dr. Seuss, who's not known in Italy, or is all right.
Yeah.
And so Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear, who's an English nonsense boy, and but that was my favorite books. So I just loved nonsense. And then in when I was 7 or 8 years old, my first book I checked out of the library was on astronomy, and I got hooked on astronomy when I was 7 or 8, and I still am. Okay. And so I remember the first time I looked through a telescope, I was 7 or 8 years old. And I remember the specific thought I had, um, uh, which is a thought you had, and which many people listening to this have had. I thought, well, I looked through the telescope and I thought, how big is this thing we're in, right? And so your mind zooms to the wall, right? But then you scratch your head, just a minute. Doesn't there have to be something on the other side of a wall?
Right.
So it doesn't make sense to say that it ends in a wall. But if you say the other seeming option, then it goes on forever and never anew. That doesn't make sense either. So my insight that night was that something about nonsense was essential for thinking about the big questions I wanted to think about. And when I was 12 years old, I realized that there's different types of nonsense. And I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the beginning of that thought in 1916. And so what I have developed is a logic of how do you think about unintelligible things. And that is the key to cracking the code. And the logic of unintelligibility may very well give us a rational proof of an afterlife.
Well, hi there. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of the interview. The full episode can be viewed on our YouTube membership program, which we are launching on January 1st, 2026. So stay tuned and join us then for the rest of the conversation and many more exclusive interviews with some of the biggest names in the field of near-death studies and beyond. Bye for now.